is in crisis. A recession looms large on the horizon. Comic book movies are bigger than ever before, and Wizards of the Coast, fresh off the most popular edition of Dungeons & Dragons in the history of the universe, are preparing to launch an entirely new edition. One that is heavily inspired by the business model of video games and designed to be playable entirely within a virtual tabletop system. The year, of course, is 2007. When did you think I was talking about? One D&D and the virtual tabletop. It's something that all of us in the D&D and role-playing game community have been talking about ever since it was announced. And yet, there has been silence online about the thing that started it all. The baby in the cradle and the cat with the silver spoon, or however that goes. What I'm talking about here is Wizards of the Coast's first attempt at creating a virtual tabletop system within the online information superhighway. A virtual tabletop system that ended up almost killing the Dungeons & Dragons franchise and built up their biggest competitor. So yeah, actually I see why Wizards haven't brought it up much recently, but nevertheless, as gamers and role players, it's a fascinating story that can teach us all sorts of lessons even today, 15 years later. So come with me now on an adventure to level up and discover the secrets of the forgotten first official Dungeons & Dragons virtual tabletop, D&D Insider, and Table. Okay, so there was meant to be a title screen there that was much more impressive, but I don't really have a budget, so let's just do this theater of the mind and imagine that there was a very slick, very expensive CGI title screen that popped up. Okay, let's go. So we're in 2007, and before we can talk about the D&D virtual tabletop system that Wizards of the Coast was calling Table, which I will do my best to try and not make incredibly confusing, we must first talk about D&D Insider. And some people might remember Dungeons & Dragons Insider. It actually only closed in 2020, but the old man that was quietly shuffled out back and pushed down a well a few years back was a ghost of the original vision for D&D Insider. In 2020, D&D Insider was simply an aged database of stats and items and monsters for D&D 4th edition. But in the glitz and glamour of the year 2007, that system was envisioned to be so much more. It was incredibly ambitious, and perhaps a little too much so. Now, I am still coming to terms with the fact that there are people who are driving cars around small toddlers today who don't remember the year 2007, but it was a pretty different time from today. That's the year 2023 for those in the future. For one, we were all happier, and perhaps the reason for that happiness was that we were also not as connected to one another, especially online. Social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter were still relatively new, and though they were gaining popularity and starting to change the way people communicated and shared information online, they were still a novelty. MSN Messenger was huge, and people were still inflicting song lyrics on their friends list as a way to not so subtly advertise their emotional state. Woe betide the person that misread your friend's personal status and opened up with a cheery "Hey, how's it going?" to a person that had some Rasmus lyrics in their status. Oof, hope you were ready for some melodramatic emojis because they were a-coming. And while D&D was incredibly popular, in fact it was more popular than ever before, we were in the world of 3rd edition or 3.5 edition, which was well loved. But even at only 4 years old, it was already beginning to feel a little overburdened with constant releases of different physical source books. They just kept coming out and they kept getting wilder. But importantly, they were entirely physical. Dungeons & Dragons was entirely physical. No online character creators, no D&D Beyond that sometimes crashes and no one can play, just some good old-fashioned everyone gathered around some pencil and paper and roll some physical dice. The extent of D&D culture at that time was Fear of Girls, a grossly underrated sketch on YouTube that is still incredibly incisive and hilarious to this very day.
Mercy? You wanted mercy? I'm chaotic neutral!
But otherwise, the internet was only beginning to filter into the mainstream, and that meant that D&D was all analog, baby. However, there was something happening that would change the world forever.
Beyond the gates of mighty kingdoms lies a vast, unexplored world.
World of of Warcraft. Originally based on a popular franchise of real-time strategy games, in 2004, Blizzard released their massively multiplayer online role-playing game, and it had burst into the world with all the grace and decorum of a newborn babe. And by 2007, it had wormed its way into all of our hearts and fully infiltrated pop culture in a way that was unprecedented for an online phenomenon. It was getting referenced in South Park, people were getting Horde insignia tattoos, and shopping malls everywhere were alight with the screams of Leroy Jenkins, something which had become very annoying very fast. And by 2007, even Grandma was trying to get in on the action by asking how she too could get a night elf mohawk, just like Mr. T was yelling about on the TV. The game's first expansion, The Burning Crusade, was released in January 2007, and by the end of that year, it had 9.3 million active subscribers, an absolutely insane amount of players in an online game for the time. This was truly an event, and for many, it was a watershed moment as they, for the first time ever, became immersed in the internet. They finally came online. This was transformative for society. But what was of most interest to every single person who lives in one of those skyscrapers made entirely of glass, basically video game publishers, was the fact that World of Warcraft's entire subscriber base of 9.3 million were regularly paying Blizzard, the developers of World of Warcraft, $15 every single month, simply for the privilege of logging into the World of Warcraft server so that they could pretend to have erotic roleplay sex with an elf in the Goldshire Inn. And as a result of all those erotic role players, in the year 2007, Blizzard made $1.1 billion. And that had everyone taking notice. And while there was a lot of video game companies that tried and failed to take the crown from Blizzard, there was one additional unexpected combatant in the capitalist arena too. Wizards of the Coast, creators of Dungeons and Dragons. Except they weren't trying to compete with World of Warcraft, but learned from that game how to take a popular existing product, specifically their own popular existing product of Dungeons and Dragons, and turn it into a platform that could be monetized in a similar way. A way that could potentially generate $1.1 billion every single year as well. And this wasn't so far-fetched. You see, the core gameplay of World of Warcraft was not necessarily erotic roleplay, as I alluded to earlier. I was being a little bit facetious there. In fact, the gameplay was mostly about going on quests, killing fishmen and union workers for money and loot, finding groups of fellow adventurers to delve into dungeons with in order to fight elite monsters and bosses to get even better treasure, and then leveling up to fight even stronger monsters and go on massive raids against huge dragons. Dungeons, yeah, that should sound pretty familiar to anyone who enjoys Dungeons and Dragons. And that's because World of Warcraft was based on a previous and also pretty popular MMORPG called EverQuest. And the creators of EverQuest, Brad McQuaid, Steve Clover, and Bill Trost, were all avid Dungeons and Dragons players, and they had drawn inspiration from Dungeons and Dragons game mechanics, world building, and gameplay loop when they created EverQuest. So really, it was Dungeons and Dragons that had inspired this massive MMORPG industry worth billions of dollars. And I mean, if the MMO genre had taken so much from Dungeons and Dragons, why couldn't Dungeons and Dragons take quite a bit from MMORPGs? It's free real estate. Step into the room, D&D Insider. Insider, I barely knew her. Ah!
The fourth part is a system, of digital offerings, which we're calling Dungeons and Dragons Insider.
Don't break the speaker.
Yes.
D&D Insider was announced in February of 2007 and scheduled to arrive later that year. This was to be the future platform of Dungeons and Dragons. This was to be the one D&D forever. Wait, wait a minute, hold on. This sounded very familiar. And that's because it sort of is. Wizards of the Coast announced D&D Insider at Gen Con to quite a bit of fanfare and excitement from the D&D community. It was to be the world's first fully integrated online Dungeons & Dragons system comprising of a searchable database of D&D rules and content, including supplements and updates to the game. Online versions of D&D magazines. Yes, magazines, they were still around, and articles including exclusive content for subscribers. More on that later. Character builders that allowed players to create and customize their own D&D characters online, just like D&D Beyond today, but a little more crude. And of course, dungeons and adventure generators that could help dungeon masters create their own custom adventures and campaigns. Essentially tools to create digital adventures. In other words, D&D Insider was going to be the online interface for Dungeons & Dragons. But as part of that interface, there was also to be Wizards of the Coast's crown jewel, a thing they called Table. The world's first fully dedicated Dungeons & Dragons virtual tabletop system, the VTT of VTTs. Now, there were VTT programs at the time like Map Tool and Fantasy Grounds, but they weren't close to the same league as what Wizards was planning for Table. The name Table, by the way, you gotta remember Apple was pretty big at the time. The first iPhone had just launched, so minimalism was in. Admittedly though, in hindsight, pretty bad name. But what set Table apart from its competitors like Map Tool and Fantasy Grounds was that where they were happy with mere tokens and maps and imagination, Table was going to bring with it a fully 3D space. It was going to be your virtual table with customizable miniatures that would be connected to your D&D Insider character. A voice over IP system that would allow players to chat with one another through the system, but be able to change their voice so the participants could sound more like a rugged orc or a girl.
Hold, Crunk, barbarian of the frozen wastes, you shall pass no further.
Dice would be fully modeled, lighting would be accurately depicted in these expansive dungeons, and monsters would appear larger than life for adventurers to do battle with. This was not a video game, but a digital simulation of Dungeons & Dragons, and with a ton of functionality. For the players, they could customize their digital miniatures. They could control the height and weight of the minis, change their eye color, pick different face and hair options, change the skin color, and pose the character in a variety of different outfits and weapons. DMs, on the other hand, could draw on the virtual map, add lighting effects, customize and build their own dungeons, and even upload their own image files to show art and clues to players in-game, much like a modern virtual tabletop. And of course, there would be e-adventures that would be available to buy. And these were basically digital pre-made adventures bundled with a dungeon biome skin, a preset dungeon, and a bunch of monsters that populated it. And this was all pretty revolutionary and hotly anticipated by an audience of D&D players who basically almost 100% of had at least tried some World of Warcraft erotic roleplay. Excitement was high. And then, well, Wizards revealed just how much it would cost. Yeah, so remember, the point of this system wasn't necessarily just to create a useful platform for players to connect across the world and to retain a record of their characters. The system had originally been inspired by World of Warcraft, specifically the money part. Wizards of the Coast wanted a subscription fee, and D&D Insider, including Table, was going to come with that subscription fee. $15 for 1 month, to be exact, which was a lot. And it did go down in price to around $13 if you subscribe for 3 months, but the really big saving was if you subscribed for 12 months, and it went down to $10 a month. Those are pretty high prices, even for today. Bear in mind that each player would have to pay this fee. So you'd be looking at potentially for a table of 6 players, including DM, around a $90 a month fee before any optional purchases or e-adventure buys. And obviously that's a dream scenario for Wizards of the Coast, but maybe not so much for anybody else. But hey, look, Wizards were giving back to the community a little. You could gift your friend a free demo for a couple of hours. So So yeah, that's good, right? Yeah. And yes, your eyes do not deceive you. That is a weird little PowerPoint presentation image in the reveal of a multi-million-dollar platform. It was just the style at the time. 2007 was pretty wild when I look back. But here's the thing. I showed you the comments earlier. The 2007 audience was just not primed for this sort of business model. I mean, sure, World of Warcraft was asking for 15 bucks a month, but that was pretty exceptional. Paying monthly to play a game, not so much, and people weren't really buying. And trying to exist only on microtransactions, forget about it. People weren't really ready to accept that kind of intrusion. Microtransactions did exist in 2007, but they were mostly consigned to cheap, poorly rated Korean MMOs that were viewed as a slight rung above gambling sites. Free-to-play monetization would take a couple of years more to get popular in Western markets, most notably, and I guess considering the context of this video, a little ironically, with the MMORPG Dungeons & Dragons Online from Turbine. And by the by, the reason for why Dungeons & Dragons Online went free to play in 2009? Well, because outside of World of Warcraft, consumers were extremely reluctant to pay a monthly recurring subscription fee. Just like for D&D Insider, or my Patreon at patreon.com/discoursminiatures. But that wasn't all. Once players started to actually see footage from D&D Table, excitement became a little more muted. Even by the standards of the time and taking into account that it was a pre-release build, the system seemed pretty crude. It had a clunky interface that was not very responsive, the graphics seemed primitive. I mean, at the time there had been games released previous to that, like Neverwinter Nights 2, that had looked so much better. And the platform just never really recovered from this initial wave of criticism. And rather than release Table in 2009 as planned, it ended up just getting stuck in development hell. It wouldn't be until 2010 when players actually got to try out Table for themselves during the open beta, and the reviews were not good. People enjoyed the novelty of running and playing Dungeons & Dragons Online, and it helped that D&D Table was so heavily integrated into the now existing system of D&D Insider. That's right, everything else from D&D Insider had released by 2010, and therefore you could literally copy and paste your character sheet from D&D Insider and put it into D&D Table and generate your character there. And yeah, that was kinda neat. But aside from that, things were bad. As a system, D&D Table was extremely inflexible. Models and tokens just couldn't really be customized to the extent the DMs wanted. Map creation just could not compare to the flexibility the DMs had offline to build their own maps on a physical table. Ultimately, trying to fit the real Dungeons & Dragons experience into a fully represented 3D table space just proved to be impossible. And the platform remained in beta until 2012, when it was quietly shelved by Wizards of the Coast without really much of an explanation. Just that they wanted to focus on future digital tools. Bit of a disappointment, really. And that was the last we heard of D&D Table. But wait a minute. At the beginning of this video, I said that this VTT almost killed Dungeons & Dragons. And there ain't been any mentions of gravestones yet, so what gives? Well, okay, here's the deal. D&D Table was meant to come out, and it was meant to revolutionize Dungeons & Dragons, and it was meant to transform D&D into a subscription-based tabletop role-playing game with a recurring revenue stream, just like World of Warcraft. But it wasn't only that business model that Wizards wanted to copy. To fit their new online platform, Wizards of the Coast had to create a whole new version of Dungeons & Dragons designed to be playable from the ground up within that digital space. And they looked for inspiration for this new version of Dungeons & Dragons from World of Warcraft. That's right, we've gone full circle. And in 2008, while D&D Table was still on track to be released within a year, the new version of Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition was released to the public. And it was the most dramatic departure from the original gameplay of Dungeons & Dragons that we have ever seen. And people were immediately shocked. Not only were the D&D Insider digital tools like the character builder available at launch for D&D 4th edition, but many of the core systems of D&D were updated to reflect modern video game MMO style gameplay. 4th edition introduced a new power system that came with cooldowns, just like in World of Warcraft. Every class in the game had an explicit party role. Fighters were defenders, sorcerers were strikers, wizards were controllers, and clerics leaders, which again were extremely reminiscent of World of Warcraft and other MMORPG party rules. And though it had its fans, D&D 4th edition was a huge flop. The game was clearly designed to be maximally playable in a digital space, and it had a lot of bookkeeping as a result. The power system, which provided players with a wide range of unique abilities that could be used in combat, required players to keep track of their character's abilities and usage. And the status effect system and the character sheets themselves could be fairly complex, requiring players to keep track of a lot of information during gameplay. Combat as well was lengthy and extremely grindy, and it felt very gamey and abstract, with a lot of classes within the same role feeling extremely similar, and very balanced in the way that a tightrope walker is. This was around the time that I personally got into TTRPGs, and the first D&D game I got exposed to at the time was Pathfinder, because in the biggest TTRPG community in my city, everyone was playing Pathfinder instead of Dungeons and Dragons. In fact, they refer to Pathfinder as Dungeons and Dragons. And the reason for this was because as 4th edition D&D abandoned the traditional D&D gameplay to chase an imagined World of Warcraft audience, Pathfinder emerged as an alternative, as a spiritual successor to the Dungeons and Dragons lineage, providing the space for Paizo, the Pathfinder publisher, to now sit as arguably the biggest competitor to Wizards of the Coast to this very day. In many ways, D&D 4th edition was the nadir of D&D, except for that one time when it was literally getting burned in the streets. And maybe 4th edition would have went down better if D&D Table had come out like Wizards had planned. But I doubt it. People like role-playing games because, well, they do something that video games can't. They are built with brains, and worlds made by DMs that are shaped around players and react to player actions. In other words, the entire hobby of role-playing is incredibly creative, and this level of creative freedom is rare in other forms of entertainment, and it allows for an infinite variety of experiences. Something that a digital platform struggles to replicate because of the central problem that the more you try to represent in the virtual space, the less room for that creative freedom is left. Fully 3D immersive digital tabletop experiences sort of miss the point of what makes D&D fun. And that's something that Wizards will need to keep in mind as we go into the next brave new world of 1D&D. Wizards' second attempt at creating a new edition of D&D designed around being playable in a fully 3D digital space. And maybe this just goes to show that Wizards have always been a little bit desperate to figure out just how to get D&D players to spend a lot more than simply $30 on a new book every year or so. This isn't a new thing. They looked to video games before with the subscription model, and that didn't really work. But they took inspiration from that sector. And now, with 1D&D, it seems like they're taking inspiration from video games once again. And considering that the trend in video games right now is that of live service, microtransactions, season pass-filled platforms, well, the fate of D&D Table should be a little bit of a cautionary tale to us all. But if you want to know exactly how 1D&D looks like it might be shaping up thanks to some big leaks from Wizards of the Coast, then check out this video here. And a huge thanks to my patrons who make this kind of content possible, especially Sonic Bread, CryptoKev, and John Smith. If you want to help support the channel, check out my Patreon at patreon.com/discoursminiatures, and I'll catch y'all next time. Bye-bye.